So welcome. I'm Karen Forget, and I'm the director of Lynnhaven River Now. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for our webinar on dune systems and coastal resiliency, how our dunes are helping to protect us from storms and flooding. I have a few logistics to go through, and then we're going to jump into the program. So I wanted you all to know that we are recording tonight's webinar, and it will be available on our YouTube channel as soon as we can get it posted tomorrow. And we encourage you to share it with your neighbors, maybe your civic league or your homeowners association, or others you think might be interested in this topic. We have 5 distinguished speakers with us this evening, and I think we're going to have a really good evening of information and good question and answer. So we will hold all questions until the end of the presentations, but you can at any time click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So make sure that you see where that is on the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A, and just click on that, and then you can type in your question at any time throughout any of the presentations, and then we will take questions from that Q&A queue or list at the end of the 5 presentations. And we welcome your questions this evening. So with that, we're going to get started, and I'm going to turn the program over to Jim Deppie, who is part of our LR Now team and is going to introduce the topic and our speakers. So thank you again for joining us.
Emily, if you can go to the next slide. Before we begin, we acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of indigenous people of coastal Virginia. They were careful stewards of these lands and waterways for thousands upon thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans, and they continue to live among us and guide us in the traditions of caring for the land and the water. We are hopeful that this gathering and gatherings such as this will help us honor them and follow their example of stewardship. And now I'd like to move on to the introductions, and each of our guest speakers this evening will introduce themselves, and we'll start off with Professor Tom Allen.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Karen, and everyone here for coming. Really been a pleasure to prepare for this. I'm a professor of geography at Old Dominion University, and I teach courses in coastal geography, geographic information systems, and work with our Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience, ICAR. So really pleased again, and I will be able to share my screen, I think, and jump ahead. There we go.
Tom, I think what we'll do is do all the
introduction.
We'll work through all the introductions, and then we'll start the presentations. Okay. And so thank you, Tom. And the next one, our next distinguished panelist is Professor Navid Tahvildari from ODU. And Navid, if you would introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Hi, Navid Tahvildari, Assistant Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at ODU. Just briefly, my research interest is on coastal hazards, impact on coastal infrastructure, and how we can use nature to mitigate storm impacts, and how sea level rise and climate change are exacerbating storm impacts on our infrastructure. And I'm also interested in interdisciplinary collaboration to understand impacts on ecosystem as well as society.
Thank you so much. And next we welcome Professor Chris Hein from VIMS.
Thank you very much, Jim. Welcome everyone, and thanks Chris Hein. I am an associate professor at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. It's the Graduate School of Marine Science for William and Mary, and also a pseudo-independent state organization funded by the Commonwealth, in part to provide research, education, and advisory service to the Commonwealth of Virginia. My research interests, I'm a coastal geologist, so I study beaches, barrier islands, dunes, anywhere from years out to the last 10,000 years of time.
Thank you. And our next introduction is Mr. Philip Roars from the city of Virginia Beach.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Karen, for inviting the city to participate tonight. I'm Phil Roars. I'm a coastal engineer with the Department of Public Works in the city engineer's office. I've been with the city for 30 years now. I'm also active, and so in the role of coastal engineering in the city, we manage most of our oceanfront projects and bayfront projects, the beach replenishments, channel maintenance. I'm also involved at a national level with a group called the American Shore and Beach Preservation Association, which sole purpose is to help guide policy backed by science. So I'm very interested in participating tonight, and thank you again.
Thank you. And our final speaker of the evening will be Frank Fentress, also from the city of Virginia Beach. Frank?
Hello, thank you, Jim and Karen, and I'm looking forward to this tonight too. I'm Frank Fentress. I have been with the city of Virginia Beach for about 22 years now. I'm a landscape architect by training, and for the last 10 years, I've led the Park and Landscape Services Division for the city of Virginia Beach. So I'm not really a scientist per se, but I do study the science because it impacts our work so closely. And I'm definitely a student of the interaction of humans with their natural environment. We are frequently called upon to settle issues between what citizens would like to do and what probably should be done with the natural environment that we live in.
Thanks, Frank. And now we'll get over to the meat of the webinar this evening and start off with, and we're going to do presentations of each of our guest panelists, and beginning with Tom Allen. Tom, over to you.
Okay. There we go. Yeah, thanks again. And I'll give you a geographer's perspective on this. Teach coastal geography, so I won't try to get into lecture mode, please. But I do like to start sometimes with a kind of off artistic or alternative perspective. And this is a painting that's sort of in the realm of surreal. It's Elihu Vedder, called The Lair of the Sea Serpent. And it challenges you to think about the scale of perspective. And for us with coastal dunes, it is a space and time imagination problem. For me, when I see this painting, I can't discern, am I looking at a giant landscape with some super monstrous beast, the sea serpent, or am I looking at something at a fine scale and I see some coastal embryo dune there with a tiny, kind of Lilliputian landscape of trees and shrubs and plants. But that's just to kind of get us thinking. Dunes, in particular, coastal geography, comprise geomorphology, and that's just the science of the study of landforms and processes that I think you'll hear from at least a few of us tonight. And myself, I use more modern technology for this in geographic information systems, satellite and aerial photography, and drones even, to study the shape and change through time. So when I approach this problem or the challenge of coastal dunes, it's very often from a systemic perspective. I need to understand the beaches, the offshore sandbars and bathymetry, the underlying sediment and availability of sediment coming into, being stored or moving away from a dune, and of course the human interactions and all of that. In addition, The graphic on the right tries to show that dunes are in dynamic process area, a very mobile area of the coastal environment. They have different morphology or shape. There is a primary foredune that we probably are principally all thinking of tonight. And there's those in its more natural state and maybe an artificial state. These are modified by wind and storms, by the mobility of different sand, of different mineralogy and texture, of course, salt spray and weathering, and they create microenvironments that are important to a lot of different plants and animals. The water table changes, both rising and falling with short-term duration of storms and rain events, and in the long term with sea level rise. So we really need to think about dunes and as a system. To have a sand dune, you have to have the certain size of sediment texture. You have to have a beach that is a provisioning source for that sand naturally, and you have to have wind then to blow it, and even to a degree vegetation to capture the sand and help build the dune up. So I think you might hear about that process today as well. In terms of their resilience, we can think of the resilience of the dune itself to disturbances, or we can think about the service that the dunes provide to our property, our activity space, our roads, and so forth. So I ask you to think about it broadly. There is a graphic at the lower right here that shows morphology of a dune in a cross section and profile by Hilary Stockton and Abby Salinger from a few years ago, some prominent coastal geologists. And they have studied how dunes represent in their shape a sort of state of a health condition in terms of the service. And you can recognize this if you walk around dunes and you see a sharp cliff or a cutoff. That's what we call a scarp or a dune scarp. You can diagnose the state of a dune by looking at the beach around it as well. And so these kind of critical geometric measurements that we can make can tell us sort of where a dune is in terms of its stability, and maybe give some advanced diagnosis as to where it's headed. And we can use computer models to predict that. Now, I've studied Cape Henry extensively. You see in my background, and done a couple of papers building off of this. And I will note a few things. We have here a massive, exquisite cuspate foreland. That's a type of cape that has built out over a period of thousands of years. And even though we've had sea level rise occurring at the same time, if you take some time and you hike through First Landing State Park, you will inevitably be encountering like the corduroy landforms of hundreds of beach ridges and dune ridges that are basically markers of the build out or progradation of that cape. And so how can we use that, the science and the process there that we've come to understand about maintaining the health of like the very narrow, limited coastal foredunes that we have today? And we are fortunate to have, I should say. And so some of the work I do, I study hurricanes and the evolution of landforms with sea level rise and climate change, much like my colleagues here at ODU and VIMS. I happened to be out surfing at Sandbridge the day after Dorian, which was fortunately for us, very fast moving storm. We had the height of waves reached just up to about the foot of the foredune, which would have been a critical point if it had stayed there for a period of time. And then we could have had erosion, pulling sand offshore and maybe carrying it alongshore with the longshore current. After storms, NOAA routinely maps dunes. And I take that satellite and air photo imagery and basically reassess the quality of the beach and the dune, potential for shoreline erosion changes and so forth. And other places are further down this path than we are. And we have sort of interceded in this path to interrupt a cycle that would be inducing essentially coastal retreat in landforms. So I use as one testament South Nags Head Exhibit a house that has been essentially condemned. You might see the septic drainage tank there somewhere in the background, and sandbags with the sand dune essentially fragmented and now totally exposed to overwash and erosion. You see scarping as well. And a further example, if you're familiar with Dr. Orrin Pilkey, a famous coastal geologist, he will point and wave warning signs about taking perhaps a hard stabilization of dunes too far. And so you have dunes that have basically been given up upon, and properties sort of forcing a process where now we have bulkheads and seawalls and rebar poking up through the beach. And we basically go into a kind of collapse phase of a coastal environment. There you see inlet there at Ocean City in the lower left, where the erosion rate on Chesapeake Island National Seashore, which has dunes, accelerated from 6 feet a year to 36 feet a year after the construction of that jetty. And at the lower right is a photograph. It says "Beautiful Beach in Seabright, New Jersey." I have not doctored that caption. I downloaded this just for your entertainment or education from Google this afternoon. And that wouldn't qualify in most of our opinions for Virginia Beach as beautiful beach. It's a hazard, and there's obstructions, and probably a risky proposition. If you visit the webpage of a private hotel and club in Seabright today, this is what you'll see. If you zoom out to it from Google, the aid of aerial photography, you'll see no foredune. You will see some beach nourishment, providing that recreational, narrowing recreational beach. And you'll see a large riprap seawall and a groin. So, I think the word caution and the need for stewardship of dunes is kind of built into this. So what I've done is start to study dunes with unmanned aerial vehicles. The image at the lower left is a reconstruction of dunes at False Cape State Park. Those dunes are largely artificial. They were built and somewhat maintained following the Great Depression by the Civilian Conservation Corps, and they're pretty extensive. There's a luxury of sediment supplied there as a result of oceanfront erosion east of Virginia Beach those thousands of years. And we have a student, now alum, flying drone imagery for us in producing these data. I think this might work. Just to give you an illustration, we can make all kinds of measurements of dunes, the volume, the height. We can look at the crest height and look for vulnerabilities. We can actually diagnose that morphology very well from 3D elevation data constructed by these unmanned aerial vehicles. And what I'm doing here is flying a drone over a non-Virginia location, I'll say, and we're looking at the evolution of fragmentation of the foredune, and then basically the reconstruction of overwash. You see, these are oriented sort of northeast to southwest. These are overwash. Well, they're beginning of overwash. They're actually blowouts, which is a type of dune too. And you see a massive scarping at the toe of the dune. You see some dark minerals that are heavier minerals at this location. And this is, to some degree, an inevitable future of dunes if we don't basically maintain a sort of rollover process for them. Right. We've seen enough of that. On to. Okay. So we're challenged here, and more thought-provoking was we have to think of the need to maintain the beach in order to maintain the dune. And that means we need to consider the beach as a much larger system in space and time, or else, question ourselves, are we facing the curse of Sisyphus, where Zeus condemned him to constantly be pushing a boulder up a hill? to some degree we are. And if we want to think about dunes as a resilience, I would encourage us thinking about them in terms of what they provide us. There's certainly storm protection, which you'll hear about, and the need to maintain and measure them, and to basically nourish them and to allow them to evolve. We need to obviously consider city and state codes, ordinances, and policies that provide for that. We need to think about after dunes and after the next major storm, how we're going to basically replenish. Are we going to build back sort of the New Jersey strong with this, or are we going to do the bouncing forward concept of resilience, where we begin to think about enabling dunes in places to take a little more natural progression? And we have other challenges that may come up. We have invasive species. We certainly have sea level rise. We have increases in storminess. Not to paint the doom and gloom picture on this, but we have some major challenges in the coming decades facing dunes. With that, I need to save some time for my colleagues and co-guests. I welcome you to reach out to me for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And now we'll turn it over to Professor Tahvildari.
Should unmute myself probably. Okay.
Terrific.
Okay. So thanks everyone for attending. I will be mainly starting from understanding how dunes are formed from smaller scale, a little bit smaller scale than Tom started with. But then I will build on that, go larger scale, and move towards, from our understanding of dunes, move towards how we use our computer models to predict the performance of dunes, especially in the face of sea level rise. And then I will feature a project that I recently got familiar with through a conference, of how we build on natural processes to create a dune to address coastal erosion. So the coastal dunes are ridges that are formed in the rear of a beach, formed through Aeolian transport. And as discussed in the previous talk, it is part of the part of an integrated coastal system. So the sediment that ends up on a dune might have been in offshore, and sediment on the dune might end up in the offshore underwater regions. So the process that the sand moves, essentially going again to a very small scale, the sand is subject to multiple forces. A grain of sand is subject to multiple forces that will keep it in place or try to move it. The resistance force is triggered by gravity. It tends to keep the sand in place. Then we have this, the push from wind, the drag force applied by wind on a grain that tends to move the grain in the wind direction. And blowing of the wind also creates a lift force. Essentially, you can think of it as the same force that lifts an airplane off the ground. Now we have grain as a fixed object, and we have wind as a force that blows against the grain, creating a pressure imbalance that results in lift of the grain. So these two forces act to destabilize the sediment. And there are modes of transport that each grain can go under. We have traction, or the creep of the sediment along the bed or along the beach. This happens for mostly larger, coarser sediments. We have saltation, which is essentially picking up the sediment, dragging it, and moving it along a parabolic trajectory and depositing further inland. And then we have the rotation, which is, happens for coarser materials. The saltated material will essentially hit the larger materials and cause their rotation along wind direction. We have suspension, which happens for much finer materials, silt and clay. They get incorporated in the wind flow and propagated further inland. And this all results in creation of these ridge structures, with mild slope, resulting and translating gradually to a steeper negative lee slope, and we have this transverse structure, generally transverse dune structure, normal to wind direction created here. Okay, so that's looking at smaller scale and only focusing on Aeolian transport. But as Tom mentioned earlier, the dune and sediment processes on the dry part of the beach generally is part of the larger picture that encompasses processes from the subaqueous or from the water side of the beach. So storms we know impact dunes, but how do they do so? Once we have a storm, we have a super elevation in mean water level due to storm surge. Wind is pushing water against the rigid beach, rigid coastline. And on top of that, we have wave setup, which is super elevation over mean water level due to breaking of the waves. Waves break, release their energy. There is a super elevation over wind stress or storm surge. So we have this increase in mean water level due to wind, due to wave and storm surge. But waves themselves are happening on top of the mean water level. So essentially what happens is that storm surge and wave setup create access for intense waves during storm towards dunes, towards upland. So we have this this mean water level now tilted towards the dune, creating an access road for waves to go towards the dune. Waves break, waves increase in elevation as they propagate towards the shoreline. They get to the breaking point, they release their energy. In the swash zone, we have the swash board, the wave board going towards the dune. And if mean water level gets to the tip of the dune, gets to toe of the dune, then we have a condition that waves can start to erode the dune and result in either reduction in the width of the dune or the eventually eroding the elevation of the dune. So we have wave breaking and runoff that will, during a storm, can cause intense dune erosion. So this is an example, the real world example of what can happen during an intense storm. This is a picture of dunes in St. Augustine, Florida, before and after Hurricane Matthew in 2016. On the picture on the up left, we have vegetated dune, healthy dune, continuous. And after hurricane, due to Hurricane Matthew, we have a breach in the dune. Vegetation is all washed, and most of the elevation of the dune is lost as well. And a consequence that is apparent here is that the wetland in the bay is exposed to wave action, tide action, and subsequent erosion. So I put some real-world surveys here to show you that the mild storms do not have significant impact on dunes necessarily. So during regular storm condition, mild storm, not severe condition, where again, the mean water level does not get to toe of the dune, we do have seasonal variation in beach topography. We do have steep slope in the beach, here shown in the survey by dotted lines. By dashed lines here, we do have steep slope during winter. A lot of sand is lost during winter, but a lot of that is coming back during summer. Beach is built back up. We have higher elevation at the beach. But the dune is pretty much intact. There is some seasonal variation, but not so much. But if we have intense storms, this is taken from a paper looking at a storm in 2009. They do have, in this beach, they do have water coming right to the toe of the dune. And I see a lot of dune erosion as a result of that because of the storm. So there is a loss of dune width because of sediment-induced erosion. Not much of the crest is lost in this condition. So we do expect dune erosion during severe conditions. But how do we predict that? We have to, in terms of understanding, well, we know the processes. We are not very good at modeling them yet because sediment transport processes, sediment and morphodynamics are complex processes, and our models are just not at that point to capture all these processes accurately. There's a lot of parameterizations involved, and we are getting there. We have computer models that are getting better and better every day, and we use in my group state-of-the-art models to try to capture those evolutions. But it is important to note that there is limitation in model applications, and we need data to improve our models in that direction. So here in one project, we looked at the impact of sea level rise and storm surge on sediment loss in a local beach. We looked at Ocean View Willoughby Spit Beach in Norfolk. Our model is, the reason I put this slide, by the way, is to show how much data goes into modeling these processes. We need to have a lot of data, local data, to be able to carry out these simulations. In this effort, we simulate hydrodynamics and waves at regional scale, and those models require tide information, wind information from climate models or data, and bathymetric topographic information to set up these models. And hydrodynamics and waves are then fed into a sediment transport and morphological model that will essentially simulate sediment transport and sediment loss, sediment transport into longshore and cross-shore direction that will result in erosion of the beach. The model also simulates the morphology of the beach. So eventually we can look into how beach profile is changed during a storm, and when we are interested in sea level rise, how the combined effect of sea level rise and storm result in beach morphological change. And this work, by the way, is the main part is carried out by my former graduate student Akash Sahu, and we are in the process of we have almost finalized the journal paper to be submitted to Journal of Coastal Engineering. So the event we looked at to study erosion in this beach was Hurricane Irene. The sea level rise scenarios were extracted from NOAA's 2017 report, high, intermediate, high, and intermediate scenarios. The time horizons we looked at was the present condition, 10-year and 50-year from now. So we looked at this stretch of the beach, and we started in the phase 1 to look into this portion of the beach, but then we're looking into other phases of the project as well to extend to other beaches in the region. The Ocean View Willoughby Spit beach for local folks is very very known to have high erosion. We have recurrent nourishment for this area, and again, it has multiple benefits for the city, for the local and region's population in terms of tourism, in terms of also providing protection for the upland. So we run our sediment transport erosion model for different sea level rise scenarios, and I've shown here three representative results. This is a transect that goes through one of the breakwaters that is shown here. And most of the erosion, as we expect, is happening around 2 meters around the mean water level. Okay, so above and below water level, 2 meters plus minus 2, we have most of sediment loss. That's the point where waves are impinging on the beach. A lot of energy is released. We expect the erosion to be happening there. So what that tells us is, as we increase sea level, then we are increasing erosion hotspot. Erosion hotspot will come with sea level up to the point that at some point will impact the dune. And as I discussed earlier, if mean water level reaches the toe of the dune, that's the point that we start to see substantial erosion. And that's what we see here in the high level of sea level rise to the panel on the right. And I'm highlighting that over here. You can see a lot of the dune erosion is happening for high rate of sea level rise. And that highlights the importance of using these models to understand where erosion happens and understand how much impact potential sea level rise will have on potentially have on dune erosion. Okay, so I wanted to also highlight a recent project that looked at engineering with nature using the concept of dune generation to reduce erosion in a highly erosive coastline. And this is taken from a presentation by George Kaminsky from Washington State. What they have in this project is a stretch of the beach that is very highly erosive, and they had historically about tens of meters per year erosion rates. So looking at the picture from aerial photo from 1999, and looking at this area, which is a coastal property that has heavily armored coastline with large blocks of large rocks essentially to protect it against erosion. If we fast forward 20 years, we see a lot of that coastline is gone at the adjacent beaches, and the property is now projecting as a headland. And what is interesting also to note is all these residential properties are gone because of the coastal erosion over these 20 years. So given that background, they are looking into reducing erosion rates for this stretch of the beach, for, both upland and downdrift of this property. So the conceptual design that was used in this project was to have a riprap made of quarry stone on the beach, on the erosive beach. And the hope was that over time, there is enough accumulation of sediment that will, again, result in formation of dune in the upland. And again, this riprap by itself will result in extending the beach. So the project was started in 2018, as you can see here, quarry stone, which is cheaper than native sand or dredging material and bringing to the study area. It turned out it was cheaper, essentially, that was used. And over the course of a year and a half, this is the picture close to the start of the project. A lot of the sand is, well, essentially still not there. But over the course of time, as you can see, it's gradually sediment is accreted because waves are now damped as they hit this riprap, they break, they lose a lot of energy, and they deposit sand. These are energetic waves, by the way. They bring in, take out a lot of sediment. So if they lose a lot of energy in this area, they deposit a lot of sediment, and that's what happens over the course of a year and a half. You see how widened the beach has become. Okay, so in this project, they also looked into incorporating a groin, a log groin in the system to catch the sediment, the longshore drift, to essentially keep sediment in place and not going into a nearby inlet. And what happened here was that over time, driftwoods, they essentially formed it in the form of tetrapods that are used in coastal armoring breakwaters. We have seen those. And they started to catch sediment. They started to act as core of groins. And over time, sand is accumulated. And this is in the course of a few years. And this is, by the way, this has happened over the course of 8 months. So over a few years, it is projected to have a dune over here. As you can see, dune vegetation is coming on here. And so over a few years, we might have a dune system in this project. So in terms of challenges and data needs going forward, especially from the modeling perspective. I do a lot of coastal modeling, and we saw some shortcomings in terms of data and information when we were doing our projects for in Willoughby Spit, Ocean View Beach. One main shortcoming was in terms of information about sediment characteristics. So we did not have a reliable basic information about sediment size. There were a few reports about mean sediment size. We used that in the model, but how reliable that is, we have to confirm. There's shortage of data in that area. We also need to have size distribution. So we know sediment don't come as a single size. And our models have the capability to incorporate sediment size distribution in them. What is D90? D50, by the way, is the mean sediment size. But what is D90? What is D30? What is the distribution, vertical and horizontal, in the beach? So with that information, we're going to be able to provide more reliable projection of beach morphology. Also, pre and post-storm beach surveys are very important to understand, to calibrate our models. In our study, we had to use beach surveys that were conducted 4 months before and 5 months after the Hurricane Irene to calibrate the model, which, as you know, it brings a lot of uncertainty, misses a lot of process in between. And we also need to know, especially for urban coastlines, we need to have an up-to-date inventory of coastal structures, and these change all the time. This gets modified. We have breakwaters that are repaired, that are modified. We have to have up-to-date information. We have to have up-to-date specification of those structures. And with that, I just acknowledge the funding for our project from Commonwealth Center for Recurrent Flooding, Resiliency, and Brian Joyner from Moffett and Nicole to share the data with us, and as well as discussions with the City of Norfolk, which was helpful. And we are looking to extend again the project to Virginia Beach. So hopefully you'll hear more from us about that project on shoreline erosion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tahvildari. Next, we move on to Professor Hein from VIMS.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. I hope by now everybody has gotten the sense of dunes as these complex systems that are interacting with waves, moving sand, wind, moving sand, and of course storms, which are the major driver there. I'm actually going to focus on another piece for most of this talk, and that is the role of vegetation in dunes, and particularly in managing dunes. So I'd start just by saying, dunes are a system. They are somewhat managed in some places. And that's the way that I think, at least as a geologist, I like to think of them, that the dune system extends everywhere that you could see on this image here. This is of the Outer Banks of North Carolina, a site that I'm going to be talking about more throughout this presentation, but this could be anywhere. This could be Virginia Beach. This could be Norfolk. And looking at this, you could see the sand being moved far out to the right side of the photo in the waves. That sand is then pushed up onto the beach by waves, including by storm waves. Storms are not only erosional, although they commonly are. And then wind takes over and moves that sand up onto the dune. This has been covered. Right? On the back side of the dune, you have these houses, the human infrastructure here as well. And so dunes are, well, as we know, they serve this role in protecting everything that's behind them. And as a result, they're largely managed systems. Just in the same way one would nourish a beach, you could, of course, build a dune. And I'll just pause just for a minute here to recognize that there are some places that are doing this really well, this management. There are several members here of the Norfolk Coastal Management and Review Board, upon which I sit as a scientist. And this is a group that brings together the scientific community, the public, the government, the local government, state, and occasionally federal government in the form of the Army Corps and VMRC, local scientists I mentioned, and the public living in this area to discuss how best to manage the beaches and dunes of the sites that Navid just discussed, Willoughby and Ocean View along the Norfolk coast. So these are these managed systems, and they protect from storms. And so there's a balance there between the storm impacts and the erosion associated with those and the management and the growth of these dunes. For example, that doesn't always hold up. These dunes cannot hold up to storms all the time. They are, however, managed to be built and restructured following these storms. For example, cases like this is up in Cape Cod, that's coir logs that have been in place to provide structure rather than using wood or a riprap, the berm, the hardened structures that were shown by, the very large boulders shown in Tom's talk, or that Navid showed for the West Coast example. These are sand-filled bags that form the base of dunes. Elsewhere, it's also soft structures like that wood that Navid showed. Here, in this case, back closer to home from me, New Jersey, the common thing is to bury your Christmas tree in the front and let dunes build out over them naturally, largely through wind-blown sand captured by those trees and by, in this case, sand fences as well. However, one of the best tools that's used to stabilize dunes without the hardening of rock or the semi-hardened structures such as logs, coir logs, or Christmas trees is a living, not dead, living vegetation. And here's an example from Virginia Beach, planting the Navy out there, planting dune grasses along the dunes of Fort Story in this case. So this vegetation plays a very important role in dunes and dune resilience. That is that the root structure of the vegetation can hold the dune together. So that's what's happening underneath the ground that you don't see, is that these grasses and shrubs that later take over in these dunes have these very broad networks of roots. You could think of it as a mesh holding that dune together. Now on the surface, what you can see is that these grasses provide, just like a sand fence, a block for wind, slowing the wind. The wind can no longer carry the sand via processes like saltation that Navid discussed. Then that sand will then fall out and land in the dune, helping to grow the dune. So vegetation plays a very important role in both natural and managed or artificial dunes. We can see some of these changes and the role of vegetation by monitoring change through time. Navid mentioned one of the main inputs that he needs for some of the numerical models he uses is pre and post storm data from these dunes. So this is what we're doing in a project that I'm going to spend just a minute or two talking about here. This is a study in collaboration with colleagues from VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, that is, and the Army Corps of Engineers. This is down in the area of Duck, North Carolina, where the Army Corps has a very neat van. It's a four-wheel drive panel van, 12-passenger van, that they've mounted on top of it a LiDAR system. This is light detection and ranging, the same LiDAR that's used to map the surface and to create elevation maps, similar to some of the tools that Tom was talking about earlier. Here, they look sideways at the beach itself, and they produce maps like this. So you see this is a map going along the beach from left to right here, and then top to bottom, that is the elevation going from about 1 meter above mean sea level, or mean low water, I think this is, up to about 5 meters above. You're looking at the dune scarp there. And what they're able to do, what we as part of this project are able to do, is to map before and after storms. So this is an example of change data before and after Hurricane Lorenzo back in 2019. So areas that are in red, the warmer colors, are regions where the dunes have lost sediment from 1 week before to 1 week after this storm. In blue, it's areas where the dunes and lower beach have gained sediment. And you can see some interesting patterns here. Some of the beach that was there before was eroded away. Some of the dune in the center was eroded away, but elsewhere along the dune, near where that black dashed line is, it's actually net accretion, or progradation as we call it, growth of the dune. And this reflects different vegetation patterns along the dune, as well as different management strategies of this dune. Looking over a longer time period here, we can look, this starts in the cold colors. Your purples are 2017, September of 2017, and the warmer colors, that maroon, are November of 2019. And you're looking at different profiles extracted from LiDAR data like that, repeat surveys taken every month or more often, and sometimes during these time periods, and plotted up here. And what you can see, starting at the bottom, you have largely beach erosion. You go in the cooler colors, the blues, you have this very wide beach in cross shore, right? So you're looking at the land is to the left, and to the right here is the active waves crashing. So you're looking at a cross section. And so you see to the right, you've lost a lot of beach. A lot of that large berm where you put your towel, it's gone. It's been eroded away through time. However, once we get up into the dune itself, well, right at the base of the dune, you see something similar. You see scarping of the dune. Yes, it grows out a little bit. If you go from blue to green, that time period, 2017 to 2018, you had growth of the dune, and later you had scarping, and you see this near vertical face of the dune here. And that's sort of what's shown in this picture to the right, taken from the Duck facility. Further up, though, you actually have growth. So here you could see that despite these large storms, despite this beach erosion, this dune scarping, going from blue to red, you actually had growth of the dune because of winds providing sediment to the top of that dune. So this gets at some of the factors involved that have been discussed already from conceptual standpoint from both Tom and Navid. Here we can now look at this and layer on top of those concepts the idea of vegetation. On the left, I have an example of what a profile of a dune would look like if that dune were constructed. That is, you push up a bunch of sand. Maybe you have coir logs or dead Christmas trees. I guess they probably all start dead, but you know what I mean, underneath the dune. And then on top of that, you build dune sand, and then you plant that dune. What you end up with is very little below ground root mass, just these tiny little roots here shown in purple. Compare that then to a natural dune where you have this thick vegetation. Automatically, we're all going to think, oh, the natural dune must be better, because the natural dune has this thick biomass, this thick root mesh underneath it, and it's natural. It must be better than what we could build. But let me show you what happens here. If we have a large storm that strikes, that erodes the beach and scarps the dune, both dunes are going to face the same problem. You go from the red to the blue here, and they both are scarped. in this case. You actually get somewhat more erosion generally at the base of the dune in the constructed dune, but you have a similar scarping. You might have less scarping in the natural dune because you'll see here that, it kind of extends down a little bit further, and that's because that root mass really holds this dune together. But then the storm is over and the whole system starts to reset. Now, forces of gravity take over. And in this constructed dune, you have slumping occur, where the front of the dune slumps down and you'll have a little pile of sand form. That's not going to happen on the vegetated dune. There, that root mass is holding that together, so you still have this very steep scarp. And the benefit of this slump here, something like what is shown here, where you can see in areas where you have thick vegetation, you have less sediment in front of the dune. In areas where you had no grass growing, you had this slump. This slump now works, this sand becomes a ramp that absorbs energy from the incoming waves, protects the dune behind it, and serves as a source for sand to be blown up and feed that dune. So there's very complex interactions here that we want to think about when considering how dunes react based on their previous management, how they were formed naturally or artificially, and their dune grasses and vegetation, such that over time you could actually have a case where you have net growth of a artificial dune, whereas you still have continued steep scarp and erosion of a natural dune, even after a period of weeks. Why is this important? Well, dune design is going to be an important component of optimizing coastal protection. How do you build or manage a dune system in a way that's most resilient to coastal change, to that rapidly rising sea level that was mentioned before, and yet also balances against the cost of doing so? And yes, we need reliable tools such as models that Navid showed to quantify the flooding and the erosion risk to plan for the future. And also need to understand how the short-term processes, such as these storm processes that we've been discussing here, interact with the longer-term change and risk and resilience of these dunes over periods of not just years, but decades or centuries. So with that, I'll end. I want to thank and just recognize at least my collaborators on the project that I highlighted here, Nick Cohn and especially Julie Zinnert, our ecologist working on this, students, Liz Davis, who I believe is sitting in at the moment, undergraduate, she's a PhD student in my lab, undergraduate Melanie Strick, and a master's student at VCU, Andrew White. And then my contact information is below. I know there'll be time for questions later, but drop me a line if you have any further after tonight.
Thanks, Chris. And we will be, with your permission, all of your permission, of course, we'll be posting these slide decks after the presentation. So people can see them if they come back and need to look at them, or also to view the webinar again if they choose. Our next speaker is from the city of Virginia Beach, Phil Roars.
All right, thanks, Jim. Well, let me just go at it this way then. I was happy to hear the three presentations that preceded. Mine's going to be a little less technical. I'm basically going to follow some of the guidance that Lynnhaven River and Alley provided us and answer some of the basic questions that they asked for us. And the first was, now here we go. Is what avenues of coordination and communication exist between the coastal scientific community and particularly Virginia Beach? And I wanted to present that we do have quite an open dialogue. We, of course, have a very long-term relationship with the Army Corps of Engineers and their Engineering Research and Development Center, ERDIC. But we also contract directly with VIMS and ODU. They've done a number of research programs for us in the past. ODU has taken a very large data set of ours and done analysis on it, trend analysis, helped us find the direction our beaches are going. And just recently, we had VIMS work with us on the Chesapeake Beach restoration project, which also had a very large dune component in that project. We also maintain a really active partnership with the American Shore and Beach Preservation Association. This group brings quite a number of scientists to the table for us to work with. Hillary Stockton was mentioned earlier. She's a friend of mine on the board of American Shore and Beach. So these are the avenues we use to bring the coastal scientists into our discussion. Also asked was, how does science guide our dune preservation efforts? And largely what we do is we have a very vigorous monitoring program. We monitor both our dunes and our beaches. We do them twice annually and during and before and after storm events. And we've amassed over a 30-year data set with twice a year surveys over all of our beaches. And this has been hugely advantageous to help us plan using trend analysis and so forth to help us plan our program. And I wanted to show you one example from Sandbridge Beach using LiDAR that's been discussed several times this evening. What we've done is we've flown our beaches several times now, but we've been able to take the previous survey, a survey of 13, the fall of 2013, and a survey from 2017, and compare those two digital surfaces to be able to map the changes in our dunes. And here's Sandbridge being illustrated. This is showing us that during that 4-year period, the dunes along this 6-mile stretch of beach that we call Sandbridge have grown about 360,000 cubic yards. Here's just another image showing how we do this. The two images on the right are actual LiDAR images, the digital terrain models. And so the top legend applies to those two images. Those are actually just the elevations. And what we are able to do is to subtract those two surface models from each other to derive what the change in the dune, and that's what's shown on the left panel, where the green is larger dune growth and reds are negative dune growth, and the very little red is just in the back of some of the dunes. So this is how we're using science to help guide our dune program. One of the other questions was asked was, who has jurisdiction over the dunes? And laughingly, that is a good question. Frank and I, who's going to speak next, work together quite a bit on dune issues. And it depends on what area of the dune mission you're talking about. The group I work for in engineering, we manage capital improvement projects. So the actual improvements or enhancements to the dunes. Our office would have that general mission. But we have a whole nother branch of public works, our operations division. They have a beach operations section. They have the day-to-day maintenance, the grooming, the patching of the vegetation, the maintenance of the sand fences and crossovers. So that falls under a separate group. Frank's group basically manages anything that's growing. We do plant some things, but in coordination with them. But Frank will get into some of his challenges with vegetation and dune strategy. But regulatory jurisdiction lies with the Department of Planning and through the Wetlands Board and the staff that supports the Wetland Board. So if a permit is required, which a permit is required for almost any dune alterations, that's managed by the Department of Planning. So there's really not one office in the city that has the dunes as their central control. It depends on what part of the dune you're speaking about. And finally, the question was asked, what roles are available for citizens, communities, NGOs in dune preservation efforts? We do have some avenues. We have done several biology club and other NGO events where we'll provide plants and rely on them as volunteers to help us in these vegetation efforts. But I guess the one thing I'd like to point out, and I think Frank may have hit on too, is for the public at large, or for the bayfront, oceanfront property owners near the dunes, need to understand that they are public assets, that one's own personal preference shouldn't come into play. And you can't just go deciding what you're going to do to the dune. It actually impacts everybody behind the dune in the city at large. So in that regard, as far as roles for citizens and communities and NGOs, one thing I would urge is that any kind of proposal that might come forward for any dune alterations or dune improvements from outside of the government, that they make sure to coordinate with the appropriate office. If you're going to be messing with vegetation on the dunes, you have to talk to Frank. And certainly you need to contact the Department of Planning and inquire as to what kinds of permits, if any, are needed for the proposal at hand. So I'm a little briefer than the others. That's what I have, but hopefully we can get into some question and answer.
Perfect, Frank. Thanks a lot. I appreciate that. And finally, we'll turn it over to Frank Fentress.
Thank you. Let me get mine, see if I can get mine up. Okay, can everyone see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm glad everyone talked about systems, because I'm going to talk about a system too, and that's the vegetation on the dunes and how we interface with the public in relation to that vegetation. And I'm hoping by the end of my few little slides that you will help me with people appreciating this picture that's on this first slide right here, that it is a really tangled, looks like a tangled mess, but it is the way the vegetation tends to become the system on the backsides of the dunes. And I'm going to talk mostly about the Atlantic Ocean dunes in Virginia Beach and start with Sandbridge. Phil showed you this, a very similar area of Sandbridge. And down here, the dune line and the front row of houses pretty much share the same space. As a matter of fact, after big storms, we sometimes have to take tons of sand off of Sand Fiddler Road because the sand all shifts and tries to equalize there. And there's really not a whole lot of dune vegetation to speak of north of Little Island Park. South of that, there's some great dune vegetation and dunes with Little Island, the Back Bay National Wildlife Refuge, and the park down there at False Cape. About the only interaction we have with vegetation in Sandbridge has to do with trying to eradicate beach vitex. It has been identified down there as a problem, and we work with the planning department to eradicate beach vitex. Pretty much from First Street all the way up to around 47th, 48th Street, there's a seawall, very little dune vegetation to speak of. And mainly our only interaction here has to do with removing sand from stationary objects and sidewalks and benches where it just blows over the wall and tries to create a dune, but it's in an undesirable location for the public. 50th Street is where we start to see some dune vegetation appearing. These homes are actually built on remnants of a dune, or it's a very high elevation compared to a lot of the other houses that you see south of them. And you can see some of these native plants on the dunes here. Seaside goldenrod and American beach grass, and farther back there's tons of vines and things growing in this kind of natural wild vegetated area. A little farther north, at 60th Street, we start seeing the grassy dune vegetation appear. And DCR has a really good kind of classification of the dune vegetation on their site. And they mention maritime dune grasslands, which is, I'm assuming what this is right here. The species tend to be the same. We see sea oats and American beach grass and panic grass. And if you look back to the left in that where the houses are, you can see the emergence of some trees. There are some smaller trees in the grassland too, but they don't tend to grow very high. This environment is extremely challenging for plants to survive in, not only because of desiccation from the wind, but desiccation from the salt spray. And typically the trees and the shrubs that appear behind some protection from the frontal dune line and the vegetation on that dune. As we move farther up north, we get to 88th Street, and here we do have the emergence of quite a few trees. This is the first view that I'm showing to the south, actually, but you can see the wide expanse of the grasses, and then there's a really nice buildup of live oaks and yopon hollies and the native vegetation that starts to emerge when there's enough protection from the wind. We've been trying to grow trees for 25 years on Atlantic Avenue in Virginia Beach, and it's like trying to grow them on these grasslands right here on the dunes. There's just no protection in some areas on Atlantic Avenue, and trees they really don't thrive there. But we do see that naturally occurring at the north end. And it really is a system. We meet with citizens and they think that, this is a tangled mess of vines that are killing the trees. And, all this stuff on the ground needs to be cut down because we want it to look like a mulched bed like we have in our yard. But all those plants are sharing that space and protecting each other during different times. The vines may be on top of the trees during that first nor'easter or second nor'easter of the season. And then the trees are going to have to survive on their own after the vines get burned back. And the tops of the trees are going to get burned. And it's a continual process of being shaped by the elements. And these plants do a really good job of coexisting and allowing sand, actually surviving sand building up around them is what they do. And that's just what I've seen through experience and from the science that I've read about. Some of the plants that we see there are American beach grass, panic grass, yucca, sea oats. I believe Virginia Beach, the north end of Virginia Beach is almost the northern extent of sea oats. It used to be the northern extent. I can remember when you could only see it at Sandbridge, and it has moved farther north just in my time working in horticulture in Virginia Beach. The vines really do cover everything, but they're mostly native vines that are good for wildlife. We've got Virginia creeper, common trumpet creeper, greenbrier, which has fruit, muscadine grape, which has fruit, native honeysuckle as well as regular honeysuckle, smilax, which is a native greenbrier, and they really do coexist well with the trees. Yopon, holly, wax myrtle, live oak, black cherry, these are all the trees that appear. Black cherry is one of the biggest. It's not a beautiful tree, but it's a tree. And we have a very, as far as urban tree canopy goes, one of our lowest urban tree canopy watersheds is the Atlantic Ocean watershed from, say, Atlantic Avenue to the east. So we value all the trees down there. And as far as regulation goes, Phil mentioned that the coastal primary sand dune really is the jurisdiction, it's regulated by the planning department and the wetlands board. So anything that happens on that primary dune, and it's mainly just where the beach grass is, they take ownership of and try to enforce whatever regulations there are. However, when it comes to the more woody vegetation, that falls on our department and division, and specifically cutting of trees and shrubs in the city anywhere on city property is a Class 3 misdemeanor. And this could be one way that we pursue someone damaging the vegetation on the ocean front. And we get calls all the time from citizens who say, my neighbor is out there cutting limbs off a live oak tree so they can see the ocean. Or my neighbor's out there trimming the live oak trees so that they just look more sculptural and, you know, have a better aesthetic appearance for them. So we go down and we, you know, immediately respond and see what we can do by education. We very rarely do the class 3 misdemeanor thing. For every tree they cut, they could be charged with a class 3 misdemeanor, and we could have them taken to court, and they could even go to jail, and they'd be fined for each one. We don't normally go that route. We do have another route. So we can go to the city attorney's office and just try to place a value on the vegetation and just send the people a bill. And not only is the person that caused the work to be done, but the contractor is held equally responsible. So we send it to the contractor and the person doing the work. It's also illegal, and I just discovered this one when I was doing the research for this presentation, to mess with any structures, grass, etc., placed to catch sand for rebuilding dunes. So I'm assuming that that would be something that maybe civil inspections would enforce. I don't really know. As you can tell, our teeth are really not very sharp for enforcing anything that's happening with the dunes, but we do our best with the codes that we have. We also have an administrative directive that prevents the city from cutting trees to provide visibility of anything, which is really important in an oceanfront situation, because people that are paying for the expensive home on the beach sometimes think that they should be entitled to see the ocean, even if it's currently blocked by vegetation. And we've had that discussion over and over with residents. I once spoke to a person that was thinking about buying a house at 86th Street, and they said, before I buy the house, I want to know if the city will let me cut down all the trees. And my answer was no. If you want to be able to see the ocean from the first floor of your house, start looking down around 40th Street, because it's really easy to see down there. But if you want to live in First Landing Park, this is your house. And this is kind of the challenge that we face. This is pictures from the last month or two down at the north end. And the one on the right, the residents took it upon themselves to actually mow the entire area under these trees, tried to remove the vines, tried to remove the trees because the trees were ugly, and it's in a terrible state. We're hoping that it will come back. We're planning on leaving it the way it is until it does come back. And the one on the left, we had actually met with someone earlier to talk about what they were allowed and not allowed to do. Told them, please don't trim the live oaks. And of course, you can see the evidence of what they decided to do down there. So we just suggest that the residents leave it alone and to call 385-4461 if they see or hear some vegetation being cut down there. And we'll do our best to try and follow up. And that's really all I have.
Thanks, Frank. Appreciate that. And we've got a very limited amount of time for Q&A. I see that some of the Q&A has been happening in real time on the Q&A screen. So over to you, Karen.
Okay, I'm gonna, let's see, how much time do we have? We only have about 10 minutes max, but I'm gonna try to send you some of the questions that were entered. Several of them I know you typed in answers for. So here's one. Plowing the beaches in Virginia Beach every night. Does this prevent dunes from forming on the cement walls in Virginia Beach? And I assume they're talking about the resort area where they come through and clean the beaches each night.
I'll take a shot at that, and I think the answer is yes, it does prevent it. However, and that may be viewed negatively. One has to understand, whether you agree with it or not, that the seawall is actually, it replaces the dune in terms of that protective project of beach and seawall, and in lieu of beach and dune, and we purposely try to keep the sand at least 3 feet below the top of the boardwalk on the seaward side to minimize the amount of sand that blows over and gets into Frank's planting areas. So since it's a public promenade used by hundreds of thousands a day or just used very densely by the public as a promenade, we purposely do try to keep sand from blowing over, and allowing that dune to would just create a ramp and allow wind to blow sand right over onto the boardwalk. So I'm sure one could find fault with that position, but that is the system we've chose to install, and we're doing our best to maintain it.
Thank you, Phil. Here's another question. Rollover is a natural beach process. We have hardened our beaches and attempted to stabilize the dunes. There is no more wash at washover flats. With sea level rise, warmer climate, with a resulting increase in the number and severity of coastal storms, slower moving storms, etc., how should our human response change? And I'll open that to anyone who would like to tackle that complex question.
I gave Eric a quick stab at that, but that's it's a little bit loaded question in that it depends, and there's going to be probably very conflicted responses to that depending on your priority and your time frame. But true, if you go south of Sandbridge into False Cape, that area, you see very large historically engineered dunes. And those are a functioning essentially like you saw with Chris's presentation and Duck. They're holding the ocean from overwashing and inlet opening ultimately in that part of Back Bay. And so over a geologic time, and I probably mean decades here, Back Bay is a lagoon that is trying to reopen and become a bay. Connected to the ocean with tides again. It may not happen in our lifetimes, but it's trending that way, and there's probably not a whole lot that can be done about that. So you might want to say the quote I use in my class, I borrow from Jurassic Park, nature finds a way, and nature will find a way to connect Back Bay to the ocean eventually on our sea level track. Not to dismiss your question, but there are places where we might see rollover occurring. We saw the southern Outer Banks, and there are rows of cottages that are now underwater plats, and they still actually have homeowners, but they are literally in the ocean now, and they cannot be redeveloped. So I would say the geologic process is going to be predominant in the long run.
Thank you, Tom. Here's another question. I think it was in Navid's presentation. You showed a 2.5 to 6 foot per year erosion rate for the ocean view beaches. Is that high, medium, low? And how does it compare to other beach areas in Norfolk and Virginia Beach?
You're muted.
Navid, you're muted.
I think 3 feet and below is typically regarded as low. So I would look at that as medium. And above 10 feet is regarded as generally high. So I would say it's medium range. And I think I still have to look at data from Virginia Beach. So Phil probably has a better idea on that. But I think Virginia Beach's oceanfront beach has a higher rate because it's more exposed it's exposed to larger oceanic waves. So I think that's the case. We have higher rates in Sandbridge oceanfront, I believe. But again, I can be, feel free to correct me.
Just to give an example of Tom's, it depends. In the case of erosion rates, a lot of my work, I work up on the barrier islands of Virginia. And there, the islands are actively washing over. They are managed to be unmanaged. That is, they are not nourished. They are not, outside of Wallops Island for obvious reasons. They are generally allowed to do as islands do, which is migrate and wash over. There, the rates of migration on the islands that are doing that, which is not all of them, some are eroding, but the rates of migration are 20 to 30 feet per year. So
Yeah.
over the last 30 years, and that's each year.
So that's great point, because the mild, medium, high rate I mentioned is from economic perspective, from beach nourishment side.
Mm.
So yes, which your perspective matters, and it depends. It's a very bad answer. It depends, but I think that's the case.
Here's another question. This is fairly long. The Army Corps is encouraging beaches along the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic to participate in 50-year beach renourishment projects at 65% federal, 35% non-federal cost share. Couple the modeling, studies 10 years old, with diminishing sand sources, and these projects are likely to need more frequent and costly replenishment. More costly renourishment than the Army Corps currently projects in their feasibility studies. How close are we to being able to couple improved erosion models accounting for sea level rise with economic analysis to get more realistic cost and feasibility estimates for the Commonwealth, the state, and local government? I don't know who wants to tackle that. Phil, I know the city does a lot of projects with the Army Corps.
Yeah, so, we do factor in sea level rise in those studies of those projects, and we also factor in economics and shore erosion. So I think, perhaps maybe not to the satisfaction of the academic world, we may not be as close as we should be or could be, but I think we already do account for many of those things in arriving at that benefit cost ratio and determining whether or not a project meets the threshold for authorization and implementation. The premise of the question also, though, I'll just address briefly, and that is that the Army Corps is encouraging beach replenishments at 65%, 35%. That in some form may have been true 20, 30 years ago, but some significant policy changes have occurred in the last 20 and 30 years. There have been very few projects along the East Coast and in the Southeast of the United States, literally none on the West Coast, as a result of policy change. So I think just the basic premise of the question should also be, at least from my perspective, challenged. That it's the Army Corps is not pushing it. They're responding to requests for study, but there have been very few authorizations.
I try to answer that in the chat. So that's a great question. I mean, from the modeling side of the question, I would like to say that typically we monitor a beach, and when it gets to the point that we, from the management perspective, we have to renourish, then we go for renourishing, right? We don't do modeling to know to project where we want to, when we want, and when and where we want to have renourishment. That comes from monitoring, to my knowledge. So, but when we look at 50-year time horizon, sea level rise comes into play, then we have a lot of uncertainty. So we have a lot of uncertainty in coastal processes already that I try to capture in terms of model calibration. We need local data to calibrate our model to be able to apply that. But when we look at 50-year time horizon, we have uncertainty in sea level rise, we have uncertainty in storm climatology, and all that will play a role in what will happen to shoreline in 50 years. So yes, we need to use our models. We need to do our best to. We have come a long way in the past 5 years. We have improved a lot in our process-based modeling. So the best we can do is to calibrate our models with local data, because the model we use for ocean view, oceanfront, we can't use it for Outer Banks. It has to be calibrated with local data. And once that is achieved, then we have to, and we want to look at the impact of sea level rise, we have to tie into account all the uncertainties with that. And then acknowledge that those uncertainties will propagate to economic analysis as well. So we can use those models to come up with conduct economic analysis, but we have to have that uncertainty band with our estimates of erosion.
Thank you. There's a question for Chris Hein, I think referring to what you said earlier about the 20 to 30 foot erosion rate, and someone asked where that was happening.
Yeah, I had a chance just to type out the answer if anyone's curious. The answer is most of them. So look, when we look at barrier islands, they're very different types of systems than what we think of as a mainland attached beach, like Virginia Beach, where you don't have a broad lagoon with a lot of marsh behind it, but it's mostly just beach that's right up against the mainland. And especially those that are not actively nourished or managed to stay in place or geologically stabilized. And all those characteristics are those found on the Outer Banks. The Virginia Barrier Islands have none of those. So you have islands like Metonkin, Cedar, Cobb, Wreck, all migrating faster than that average rate that I gave. Others are not migrating, but are just eroding and getting thinner. And that's Paramore, Smith. And then the final one is Hog Island, which is the oddball in the system. It doesn't really grow or shrink over a long time. It kind of moves in place. It rotates, as we'd say, but it's not. It's actually not eroding on net over decadal timescales. And then finally, Fisherman's Island at the southern end, the one that you land on coming off the CBBT, that's actually growing and has been. And that's simply because something that Tom spoke about earlier, there's this idea of longshore transport, that sand is moved down the beach. And in this case, from one island to the next, here starting probably up in Delaware or Maryland, moving down along the coast. And the what we call the depot center, the end point for all that sand is something like Fisherman's Island, and hence why it's growing. That's where all the sand eroding from all the others is ending up. That's similar to, in fact, Cape Henry that Tom spoke about. It's the depot center on the other side of the bay opening, which is why it's grown through time, whereas at least over long times, whereas other beaches have eroded. So yeah, it's a complicated system. Also with dunes, also over the short time period, you could go to a place like Paramore or Hog and watch dunes grow and erode. You could watch these dune vegetation interactions. The same processes are occurring. It's just that with so little sand available naturally, the overall dynamics of migration and washover take over in a place like that.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, one quick question before we close. Christmas trees were mentioned, and I know that at one point in time, the city of Virginia Beach collected trees in the bayfront area. Are you still doing that for dune stabilization?
No.
No. Okay.
And in fact, we don't recommend it. And you know, they do capture sand. That's true, but they also become detritus. They They also catch fire. We had a pretty significant dune fire in Croatan, and it was Christmas trees, and all it takes is a cigarette flicked carelessly towards them once they get all dry and brittle. And once that fire starts, I mean, it really caused some damage to the dune. So in general, as Frank was alluding to, we ask citizens not to mess with the dunes. You're not doing us any favors by putting a Christmas tree in the dune. If the dune needs a sand fence to stabilize it, pick up the phone, call us. We'd be glad to put one up.
Very good. And I'm going to repeat that phone number, 385-4461, that Frank had in his presentation. If you see anyone trimming or removing vegetation or doing things that are damaging to our dunes, that's the number you call to report it. I want to thank everyone for your participation tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to Jim to close us out.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks a million to our panelists. I think this was super informative for everybody. And Emily has just posted a slide up there. We're going to be this webinar has been recorded, and we'll post it tomorrow on our YouTube channel. And so we will send you links to it, panelists, and you're welcome. Please share it. This is the first in what we hope to be a series of continuing citizen science webinars. And we're looking for future topics. We're thinking about things such as green infrastructure and the importance of trees and coastal resiliency, but there are plenty of others. And this is a great opportunity to have our citizens and legislators and city officials and the science community kind of interact in real time. And I think it's been a lot of fun. So thanks again to all of you for the hard work you put into creating your presentations, and for the energy you put into them. It was a really good session. Thanks again to all, and have a great evening and stay safe out there.